Okay, so first, can you tell me your name and what you do for a living?
Yes, I'm Deborah Levison, and I'm a professor at the Humphrey School of Public Affairs at the University of Minnesota.
Okay, and today we're going to be talking about child labor in Indonesia and mainly around the palm oil industry. So, can you just tell me what kind of work you've done previously around child labor?
Well, that would take a long time because I've been working on child labor for over 20 years. I have not done any studies in Indonesia, although I've read some of the ones that have been done. But my area of child labor is more about when does work interfere with education for children? What sort of work do most children do? I'm focused more on the ordinary ends of work that millions of children are doing rather than the extreme types of forms that you're talking about in Indonesia.
Okay, so you do more like staying home and taking care of younger siblings and like cleaning the house and stuff like that?
So technically that has not even been counted as child labor until very recently.
Okay.
No, it's more like farming.
Okay.
And it could be domestic service for other people. And I mean, the most common types of work that children do around the world are farming related, but it's mostly for family members and taking care of house chores, children, yes, that kind of work that economists like me might call non-labor force work.
Okay, awesome. So do you, hopefully the country of Indonesia is trying to help stop this, but do you know if, as the United States and other countries, if they're trying to work to help stop this, not necessarily in Indonesia, but in other countries too, if other governments like America or Western Europe are trying to help prevent this, or if they're just kind of letting it be?
So there are organizations that are working to reduce the worst forms of child labor, and that's what you're talking about in Indonesia, right? Where it's quasi-slave labor, or slave labor really,
essentially, yeah.
And it's abusive. So that's what's called the worst forms, as you know.
Yeah.
And the U.S. Department of Labor does fund projects that aim to reduce the worst forms of child labor. The International Labor Organization, which is based in Geneva, also has projects aiming to do that. It's very tough though, because in Indonesia they're up against very big, very wealthy organizations, and so these non-governmental organizations or governmental organizations like the U.S. Department of Labor, they just don't have that much money compared to these huge multinational firms.
Okay. Money gets you everything, so.
Money gets you a lot.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Fortunately. So every time that you look at just case studies and you look at studies that have been done about child labor, is there one thing that just hits you hard every time and just kind of makes you go, how is that even possible?
So
does that make sense?
It does, and you're coming from the perspective of somebody who is looking and thinking only about worst forms. And yeah, it's always jarring to realize how people can treat other human beings. I, however, think that people often confuse regular work that's done by children with worst forms a lot, not understanding that there are some positive developmental aspects of work for children. And so they tend to group everything together as that one really horrible, very bad thing, when there's actually a very big spectrum in terms of both abuse and the badness of the child labor, and also the positive things that come with it. So, for example, it's very tricky to know when to tell a child not to work. say that person is an orphan or is taking care of a very ill parent, say with HIV or cancer. The child may be the person who's making sure they're not starving to death. So what's worse, to let them work or to let them die? So the trade-offs are much more complicated than people want to talk about.
So it's not as black and white as people think it is.
Absolutely.
It's all gray.
Well,
majority
I mean,
gray.
the worst forms that have been documented in Indonesia and some of the sources that you have, for example, are pretty clear. However, again, you might have a situation where somebody would continue to work and want to continue to work in under terrible conditions because they don't see any alternatives. And that's part of our problem as human beings in the world, that we're not sharing, right? We're not sharing resources with each other across countries and even within countries. So yeah, if they had alternatives, then that would be one thing. But what people are saying is they have to stop that work. But what they're not saying is, when they stop that work, we will provide them with an alternative way of living and of being.
Because a lot of the children are helping to raise money for their families, but if you would stop them from working, they would have no way to help feed their families or anything like that.
Yes.
So what kind of alternatives do you think there are that would be a good trade-off?
So making sure that children are in school when they should be in school, with food, like breakfasts and lunches provided at school helps, because then nobody has to pay for the food for those children. There are programs called conditional cash transfer programs you may have heard about. There's a very famous one in Mexico that started out being called Progresa, and now is called Oportunidades. Oh no, it got renamed again. Anyway, I don't remember its latest incarnation, but what they do is they go to poor rural areas and they say to the mothers, look, if you keep these school-aged children in school and they attend school most days and they're keeping track in school, and it's, 85% of the days they have to be in school, at the end of the month, we'll send you money. And that money will be enough so that you can pay for their food. They don't have to work. And it's less money than they would get working normally, but it's enough because mothers want their children to go to school.
Yeah.
So cash transfers actually are quite effective at getting kids into school. They're less effective at reducing work altogether, but maybe that's not so bad because kids learn a lot from work.
Yeah.
If it's not abusive, there are very good things that can come out of that.
That makes a lot of sense. So you said you work a lot around like how child labor affects a child, like mentally, or based off of school, correct? Or around school?
So there are different things. I believe that children should be learning as they grow up.